On July 17, 1996, at 2030 EST, flight TWA 800 would become the USA's third most disastrous aviation crash in the country's entire history to date. And just as dramatic as its place on the list of deadliest aviation calamities, so too was its final flight and the colossal explosion that lit up the night sky that brought an entire airline company crashing into the Atlantic Ocean. 1-minute communications are as standard as any other day. And next, the line goes dead and TWA is missing from the radio, and the sky for that matter. So what exactly happened here? Here's the story of a ticking time bomb. This is the story of TWA 800. Back in 1996, Trans World Airlines was an airline that dominated the skies for nearly 70 years. Recent financial mismanagement, a handful of deadly crashes, and more scandals than we can count already had them scrambling to stay afloat by the 90s. The writing was on the wall for TWA long before the crash of Flight TWA 800. The airliner finally shut its doors for good in 2001, and TWA 800's terrible fate is a big part of the reason why they finally closed up shop. TWA 800 was scheduled to take off from JFK Airport in New York City. Though their final destination was set for Paris, France, they did have a layover planned in Rome to refuel and drop off some passengers. She was a Boeing 747-131 released in 1970. She had a pretty average track record as other similar models at the time. She clocked in 93,300 flight miles and nearly 17,000 cycles over the years. And all in all, her records were relatively unremarkable. In the month before the accident, Flight 800 was used to train sniffer dogs, specializing in finding explosives. The dogs were led into the storage compartments where boxes containing traces of explosives were hidden for them to find. Before you jump the gun, no explosive material was not the cause of the accident. But we do need to mention the training because it complicated the investigation later. Another noteworthy event was the reports from the pilots and maintenance crew on the plane in the weeks before the accident. Quite a few pilots reported erratic readings from the malfunctioning fuel quantity indication system. FQIS reads the amount of fuel in the wing and center tanks. Maintenance also logged a number of electrical problems, specifically related to the plane's wiring. Chafing, corrosion, and general wear and tear on the wires were due for replacement. It's not like dials were going totally haywire or that lights were flickering like a bad horror movie, nor was TWA 800 behind on her maintenance schedule. It's just that this would probably be one of TWA 800's last flights before she went in for a good overhaul and large-scale wiring replacement. Besides, every time the fuel readings went a little wonky, it recalibrated within minutes and returned with accurate readings. So the problem wasn't considered terribly dangerous at that time. TWA was already under a great deal of financial constraints, so they certainly pushed their fleet's maintenance as far back as the law would allow. So TWA was not out of legal bounds, and technically not neglectful. They just weren't in a hurry to fix a problem that only had the potential to cause trouble right at that moment. With that said, let's have a look at the crew and passengers on board that day. 57-year-old Captain Steven Snyder was heading the cockpit with 18,800 flight hours under his belt. Next to him was First Officer Richard Campbell. He was 63 years old and getting ready for retirement after recording 17,000 flying hours. Neither pilot had any significant blemishes on their records, and both men were known for being very meticulous, professional, and highly experienced in their profession. When investigators later looked at their records, it was crystal clear that the probability of either of them making a mistake was virtually zero. 20 off-duty employees of the airline were on board, as well as 18 working crew members. The passengers consisted of Frenchman Michael Brestroff, an ice hockey player, and Marcel Duddy, a well-known guitarist, Jack O'Hara, an exclusive producer for ABC Sports, David Hogan, an American composer, and Rico Fullman, a well-known German photographer. But most tragic of all were the 16 students from the Montoursville area high school. The French club and their 5 adult chaperones were going to France to immerse themselves into the language and culture. The kids were incredibly excited about the trip and were all smiles when they lined up at the terminal, waving goodbye to their parents. All in all, there were 230 people on board at 6 o'clock that evening. Unfortunately, the flight was delayed for 2 hours because a ground service vehicle had broken down on the tarmac and they couldn't take off until it had been moved. The captain ran the air conditioning, heated the fuel for takeoff, and double-checked his checklist to pass the time. Finally, at 8:16, TWA 800 was cleared and its wheels left the tarmac. At first, everything went perfectly well. The rise was uneventful, and as you hear, the pilot's communication with control was as standard as any other day. It all sounds pretty run-of-the-mill, doesn't it? But there's something that everyone missed at that time. 2 minor breaks in the recordings, glitches that were only a fraction of a second each. Here, listen to them again. We'll highlight that part of the recording for you. As we'd discover later, that minor glitch wasn't a glitch at all, but instead there were 2 back-to-back short circuits in the wiring that fed the radio, causing an interruption in the recording. So let's refresh. They took off at 8:16. The first interruption happened at 8:29, and the second at 8:30, and another minute later at 8:31, 8 miles off the coast of Long Island, TWA 800 exploded. There was no sign or word from either pilot that anything was amiss. One moment they were reporting on altitude, and next the line just went dead. The dark sky illuminated the water, and the coastline in one huge shower of flames, and chunks of ignited debris raining down into the ocean. The ocean surface, now covered in a layer of jet fuel, was alight too. Boiling the water surrounding the oil slick, several planes in the vicinity called it in, and no less than 200 civilians on land witnessed an explosion in the sky. Emergency services raced to the scene minutes after ATC got the first report. The first vessel to arrive was a 110-foot Coast Guard cutter, captained by Commander Jeff Ruggieri. Ruggieri took the lead and had every arriving helicopter, police officer, Coast Guard vessel, and even a few privately owned vessels that arrived to volunteer their services organized and on the water in 40 minutes. Getting into the heart of the floating debris before that point was almost impossible. Even after 40 minutes, some of it was still burning, and it was the rescue teams that put the last flames out. They searched throughout the night and all day, but every single one of the souls on TWA 800 had perished, including 16 high school students who were probably dreaming of croissants, art, and all of the pictures they were going to take, hardly believing that they were fortunate enough to take this once-in-a-lifetime trip to another continent before their lives were snuffed out in a blaze of burning fuel and ocean water. But while the recovery mission was getting underway, odd reports from witnesses were starting to come to light, and the newspapers were raging with reports that there was a burning tail behind the plane, streaking toward TWA 800, and that it connected with the plane, leading to the explosion. This was probably just a conspiracy theory, born out of hysterical citizens who'd mistaken another plane flying in the distance for a missile, right? Normally on this channel we would have accepted that. It makes sense after all. There were quite a few planes in the sky at that moment, and the explosion happened during twilight. The light at the stage of the day can easily trick the eyes, especially when clouds, light pollution from the city, and fog are taken into account. But there's a little hitch with this theory, and we can't deny that it's a suspicious detail that makes even our logical thinking go haywire. The radar readings around the time of the explosion definitely picked up on the sudden burst of heat that came from TWA 800. This theory goes out of the window when radar readings are looked at. Their readings are just too big to attribute to a single fuel tank explosion. The readings were twice that of what would be expected for an explosion of that size. Now, it could have been another one of those pesky glitches, This is 1996 technology after all, and back then, specific temperatures couldn't be determined. The size could have been grossly overestimated due to the plane's close proximity to the water, and that reflection off of the surface might have skewed readings. These are all possible explanations given by experts, but all of them are yet to be proven by any similar events or experiments. Since the official statements are that it wasn't a terrorist attack and that there was no known missile, we'll be going with that line of thinking from this point forward. Besides, why target an aeroplane with civilians on board? There were no potential political targets that would give anyone any reason to target it. While families were notified that they lost their loved ones and vigils were being held all over the country, the extraction was commencing. Even President Clinton gave a public statement of condolences and assurances that a thorough investigation was underway. The Navy arrived to assist in the operation that lasted for 2 whole weeks. In total, 196 of the passengers were retrieved, leaving 34 missing individuals that would be lost in the ocean forever. Most of those 34 missing were seated right above the fuel tank, further indicating that that was the source of the explosion. Their bodies were essentially vaporized, and there was just nothing left of them to find. More than 1 million pieces of wreckage was found and brought back to land, where the painstaking process of rebuilding the plane inside a hangar began to take place. Piece by piece, almost the entire body of TWA 800 was put together like a macabre puzzle of torn and ripped up metal. There was no question about where the explosion took place anymore, once the hull was pieced together and they could take a good look at the damage. The entire underbelly of the plane had been splintered to shreds. There were barely any of the innards, like wiring or tubing, left off it. The black box and the 2 boxes holding the recordings were retrieved. The boxes holding the recordings were so damaged that to avoid any further contamination from occurring, they were hauled out of the depths inside, containers still submerged in seawater. Retrieving the information on them took 4 years to clean up and listen to in full. Keep these recordings in mind. Besides these 2 glitches we mentioned earlier, they're going to divulge one last bombshell when their contents are finally heard. Luckily, Black Box was in relatively good condition and shape and was analyzed in just a few days. From it, they could tell that TWA 800 was in the air for approximately 12 minutes. They were 488 feet above the ground, and the 12 sensors inside the fuel tank read that the jet fuel inside was not at exactly 53 degrees Celsius at the time of the explosion. Normally, this high heat in the fuel tank wouldn't be a point of contention at all. Jet fuel is not really as flammable as we'd like to think. In its liquid form, you can drop a live match into it, and the match will simply go out without ignition at all. When it does become extremely combustible is when it's heated, like it would be in a passenger plane during flight. Internally, the plane heats up the tank using its air conditioning pipes. Once it's heated to 35.8 degrees, the liquid fuel turns into vapor, and it's at that point that a jet engine can utilize the fumes to operate. As long as the tank stays sealed off from any potential points of ignition, this is exactly what a Boeing is designed to do. However, add a spark or a flame to that vaporous jet fuel, well, suddenly you've got a problem. There are some wires that run into the tank directly, but not only are they supposed to be completely insulated, those sensors run on such a low voltage that it's virtually impossible to get a spark out of them if a short circuit occurs. The temperature was still somewhat higher than would be expected, but if you remember correctly, there were reports of temperature readings being inaccurate in the months leading up to the accident. So they were not sure whether or not this data was even correct. Engineers investigating the crash were sure that a spark ignited the fuel, no matter how unlikely it seemed, but they had to prove it first, and for that they needed to get creative. They took another Boeing 747 of around the same age and replicated the series of events leading up to takeoff. The plane was filled with the same amount of fuel and left to idle on the tarmac for 2 hours, with its air conditioning on, just like the captain had done when TWA 800 got delayed. When the test Boeing took off from the tarmac and reached 4,800 meters into the air, the sensors came back with the temperature readings inside the fuel tank. Care to take a guess what the temps were? Yep, 53 degrees Celsius. a full 17 degrees above vaporization stage and identical to TWA 800's black box. So the readings were correct after all. Now it came down to finding the source of the ignition. The first place they would have looked would be the wiring around the tank, but since the whole belly of the plane was disintegrated, there was nothing left to examine. So they took a look at the test plane to get an idea of where TWA 800's wire bundles would have been placed to map it out. Shockingly, their test plane was in a deplorable condition, despite its maintenance record being spotless. The bundles of wires that run along the belly of the plane that operate lights, call buttons, and communication systems were virtually side by side to the fuel tank. The wires had cracked insulation. They were shaved wires, temporary repairs made with duct tape that were just forgotten about and left there to degrade for years. And they found metal shavings from previous maintenance jobs littering every corner of the plane. The metal shavings spent years floating around the innards of the plane, further chipping away at the already damaged wires. So they went out to examine other 747s that were manufactured at the same time as TWA 800 from multiple airlines and companies. All of them had the same problem, every single one. This meant that there were no fewer than 1,200 Boeing 747s flying across the globe at that very moment, and all of them had the potential to explode in mid-air any day now. But all that they'd proved was that terrible maintenance practices were a safety concern across the globe. They still hadn't proved that there was any short circuit inside the fuel tank that could have ignited a massive explosion. And there was no other plane that had experienced this exact set of circumstances before. Only 7 other explosions of a fuel tank on an airplane had occurred in the last 30 years, and all of those events had a definite flashpoint that ignited the fuel in the tanks. Lightning strikes, terrorist attacks, bombs, that sort of thing. Not one instance of bad wiring causing a short circuit. Then the lab results from the wreckage came back and they showed signs of explosive materials, and a whole new slew of paranoid terrorist attack theories made its rounds again. It took some valuable time, but investigators were able to prove that it was simply residue from those canine training exercises that occurred a month before. Multiple canine trainers and airline personnel testified that one of the packages had accidentally torn. The residue was cleaned up thoroughly, and the minuscule traces that were found were on parts of the plane that were far away from the fuel tank. Every single one of the training packages were accounted for, including the damaged ones, confirming that the witnesses were telling the truth. This disaster didn't happen because of a planted explosive. That much was certain. The investigators even built a 1/4 scale model of the fuel tank, proving that a short could ignite the jet fuel fumes. After 4 hours of painstaking investigations and spending ridiculous amounts of money to build models to try and prove that a short circuit was the cause of the explosion, investigators were no closer to proving anything. Yet, they were sure that every Boeing in operation was a ticking time bomb. Decades of budget repairs and bad maintenance practices meant that this kind of disaster was going to start becoming commonplace, and thousands of lives were at risk. And as we know today, a little thing like metallic shavings isn't detrimental now. It's deadly many decades down the line. There is a saying in the world of aviation: the sins of maintenance are often visited upon aircrafts long after the work is done. And this is a stark reality that's been proven true time and time again. A single corroded line is all it takes to bring down 200 tons of steel. If there was ever a silver lining to the deaths of the 230 people on board TWA 800, it was this investigation. This theory had already been a point of contention on the table for years at this point, but never really definitively proven, was finally going to receive the recognition that it deserved, that we and the family of the passengers deserved, and that final straw came when the recording boxes finally came to light. After 4 painstaking years, the whole of those recordings were stitched together, and it was earth-shattering. Right as Captain Steven Snyder left the runway, approximately 2 minutes and 30 seconds after takeoff, he made an offhand comment to his co-pilot. "Look at that crazy fuel flow indicator there on number 4. See that?" This definitively proved that the wiring that led from the fuel tank was malfunctioning. just like the previous pilots reported in the months leading up to the explosion. They now had 3 separate experiments proving that it could happen, several reports filed by pilots of the same issue, dozens of Boeings with old, damaged wires that were all flying with the same condition that TWA 800 was suspected of flying with, and now the same set of theorized conditions coming straight out of the captain's mouth just minutes before 2 back-to-back interruptions of the same electrical pathway was picked up audibly on the recordings too. Even if all of these separate events could be considered circumstantial, this now equated to almost a dozen coincidences that all led to the same conclusion. Bad wiring caused a short circuit right outside the fuel tank, and since those wires were all smashed together in a mess of rusted and duct-taped bundles, that short circuit jumped to the wire that led to the fuel sensors right inside the fuel tank. This short had more oomph than the sensors were designed to operate on, and that surge was enough to cause a spark that ignited an overheated, fume-congested fuel tank that erupted with the force of a bomb. It fractured the 747 into quite literally a million pieces, taking every single one of the 230 souls on board down with it in a shower of flames. The mystery of what took down flight TWA 800 could finally be laid to rest, but that conclusion was Trans World Airlines' doom too. Just 1 year after the case was closed, in 2001, TWA was absorbed by American Airlines and was officially no longer in business. But are we even surprised? In its 71 years of operation, the company had 106 accidents, which equated to a total of 1,582 deaths. To put that into perspective, American Airlines holds the world record for the most fatalities due to aircraft accidents, with a death toll of 858 people. TWA had nearly twice that amount. TWA as a whole is a can of worms that could take up an entire video with all of their scandals. The real takeaway from this incredibly tragic event is that the insistence of those investigators and engineers to prove that bad maintenance was putting millions of lives in danger was right all along. Their refusal to back down is the reason that protocols were completely overhauled and thousands of planes got the makeover they so sorely needed. They are the real heroes here. Unfortunately, the fact that we get to travel much safer today came at the expense of more than 200 people, some of whom never even got the simple human right to have a funeral.